Can everyone hear me on this? Yeah. Um, wow, what an introduction. I don't think I mean, Chandan is a dear friend and teacher, I imagine, to so many of us in this room. And I'm just so grateful to be here and honored to be here with you. And, um, you know, it's been a very tough few months. It's been a tough time in general, but I think coming into this next few days of what's about to happen, I feel so incredibly inspired and honored to be in this space, and it's giving me a lot of hope that I desperately need right now. So thank you so much for being here. I am going to do some slides. Hopefully that's okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and the book and some of what Chandan talked about so eloquently, and hopefully I can do it justice. But like you said, we're going to have some time to talk, and I'd love to hear from y'all and sort of hear more about what folks are interested in. Hopefully this will just give us some grounding going into what we're about to be in for 4 years. So like Jonathan said, my name is Silky Shah. I'm the executive director of Detention Watch Network. And a little bit about Detention Watch Network. We're a national coalition building power to abolish immigration detention in the US. We were actually founded in 1997, which is right after the passage of two really draconian laws in 1996. And in fact, this moment, I can't tell you how many times everybody has just been like, it feels like we're back in a 1996 moment. Granted, I think I was 15 years old then, and many of you weren't alive then. But the point is that it's a really, really harsh moment for our movements and what we're trying to do. And in that moment, and I think in one of the lessons as I was writing the book was that actually every time something happens and shifts the conditions, actually a lot of beautiful work emerges from it. And I think after the 1996 laws passed, where the detention system doubled, a lot of different things happened, and immigrants became even that much more of a target. Like Detention Watch Network emerged, a lot of organizations emerged to say, no, we're going to fight back against this. So it's something to think about in these moments when it feels like things are so dire. Actually, there's a lot of beautiful organizing that comes from those moments. So we became a formal membership network in 2005, and we started having staff then. We have about 16 staff across the country right now doing organizing, advocacy work, communications work to end immigrant detention, which looks like a lot of different things, and I can talk about that. But we're really, really committed to organizing and building power around these questions as trying to really make the connections between the incarceration of immigrants and incarceration more largely as well, which I'll talk about. And so, as Jonathan said, here's my book, Unbuild Walls. This came out last May. I wrote it a lot a couple years before that, or a year and a half before that. And the conditions, it was sort of wild from May whenever it came out, and the conditions started to shift even that much more and more to the right when it came to conversations around immigration, which I'll eventually get to. But I started conceiving of this book in 2021 after the incredible uprisings for Black lives in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and other folks, and how we saw people coming to the streets and saying, actually, no, we don't want these systems. We don't want to live like this anymore. And it actually opened up a lot of space for us to make the case against immigrant detention. And so for me, as somebody who had been had embraced abolition many, many years ago. In 2003, I kind of it's like, I'm an abolitionist. It was wild to see how much the opening around that actually created the conditions for us to make the case against immigrant detention. And so I thought there was a lot of lessons learned there. And I was like, okay, I guess I can write about some of this. So I'm going to lay out a few of the arguments of the book. My entire goal was to make the case for abolition, really. And in this specific context, prison abolition, I know abolition has a lot of it's kind of evolved into a lot of different frameworks and thinking, which has been so beautiful. But in this case, I very intentionally focus on prison abolition, and abolition of the prison industrial complex specifically. Um, and I do that in a few ways, and I'll sort of lay out three of them here. First, I share the history of the system in order to show that immigration enforcement and the prison industrial complex are fully intertwined, and that the same logic that resulted in mass incarceration also resulted in the mass detention and mass deportation of immigrants. The second way is explaining how reformist approaches have not only served to expand detention and deportation, but have also pitted communities against each other, which doesn't help any of us, and especially communities of color and working class communities. And the last point is to show how a better understanding of these intersections and an abolitionist lens have helped us curb deportations and detentions of immigrants currently living in the US. And I think we have to hold on to that. Like, we were at that place. I think we're about to be in a different place, but there's also a lot of opportunity to push back. Despite the moment we're in, I still strongly believe that abolition is an essential lens and guiding star for our immigrant justice work. So, how are these systems intertwined? Perhaps the most obvious connection is that the roots of these systems trace back to anti-Black racism. The modern detention system as we know it began to take shape in the early 1980s when the arrival of Haitian and Afro-Cuban migrants in South Florida. The US began to indefinitely detain Haitians in large numbers, deeming them economic migrants, not worthy of asylum. And many advocates and political leaders began to question the systemic detention of Haitians. And here you'll see there's Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was a longtime activist and civil rights leader and presidential candidate at some point, who was calling attention to the conditions in Chrome, the Chrome Detention Center in South Florida. And in order to basically make the system seem less racist, rather than releasing Haitian migrants, the government started applying a policy of de facto mandatory detention to broader categories of people, which at the time was largely Central American migrants fleeing US-backed wars in the region. So this is still the era of the Cold War. So it was actually the logic of anti-Black racism and racism more generally that served to create and expand the detention system. So you can see this is an image right outside of Chrome, and this was in 1981. Really kind of the first modern detention center that kind of is still in existence today. People are still detained there today. The war on drugs was also in full swing at this point. So again, this is in the 1980s. Tough on crime laws were flourishing at both the state and federal levels. More and more people were being locked up, and the system started to snowball, as you can see from the graphic. The Immigration and Naturalization Service, which was sort of the precursor to ICE and some of the other agencies within DHS, had often used federal prison capacity to detain immigrants, but the lack of space due to growing numbers of people in the prison system resulted in ICE building and contracting its own facilities and becoming a mass jailer in its own right. So INS, actually, sorry. We also start to see these intersections playing out in federal legislation. In 1988, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act officially legalized mandatory detention. And people might have heard it. It's coming up a lot right now because it's in this bill called the Lake and Riley Act. So mandatory detention, they're really trying to expand it. And that's a lot of the reason why you see people detained without any due process. So in 1988, it officially becomes law. Even though they're sort of doing it in a de facto way, their answer was, let's do it and then make the case, and then eventually it becomes law. The 1988 Anti-Drug Abuse Act officially legalized mandatory detention of immigrants for certain crimes, the list of which continues to expand over the next decade. And so, and I think many people probably in this room know this, but in 1970, there was roughly 300,000 people in prisons and jails in the United States. By the year 2000, it was over 2 million. That kind of went down, and we're in a place where it's starting to go up again. And the political conditions are obviously pertinent. As Shandon was mentioning, there's also the political economy of these systems. This is from a graphic from this great comic book series called The Real Cost of Prisons, that some of our comrades like Craig Gilmore and other folks worked on. So like the prison boom, in which economically challenged rural communities began to see prison building as a form of economic development, the same theories were applied to the expansion of immigrant detention. As Tracy Hewling notes here, from 1990 to 1999, 245 prisons were built in rural and small town communities, with a prison opening somewhere in rural America every 15 days. In the immigration context, this, of course, included the private prison industry, which is a gross byproduct of the rise of neoliberalism. But it also included many counties and localities vying for detention contracts in order to supplement local budgets with federal money. And the federal government eventually bankrolled some county jail expansion to warehouse more immigrants. So the first instance of this detention itself actually being a sort of economic development strategy was the case of the Oakdale Detention Center, a federal correctional institution, it says here, but this is sort of a mapping of where Oakdale is in Louisiana. And, you know, at the time, Rudy Giuliani, who, you know, has a very long and storied history, but at the time he was at the Justice Department, and it was actually his responsibility to sort of oversee detention, and he kind of helped this process start to move where it became an economic development strategy. And this was in the mid-'80s, like early mid-'80s. And so from Oklahoma to Louisiana to Virginia, localities vied for a detention contract. And in Oakdale, Louisiana, where the community had the highest levels of unemployment after a local paper mill closed down, the mayor courted INS. And the senator actually threatened INS's funding, like, because, you know, Congress has this, like, you know, appropriates funds, and some of those funds go to states. And so basically one of the senators, and it goes to different agencies, right? So one of the senators who was in Louisiana at the time said, well, I'm going to give less funding to INS if you don't put this prison here, this detention center here. And that, you know, that and sort of like the intensity of how much this town wanted it actually got Giuliani and INS to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and go with the Oakdale facility in Louisiana as opposed to these other attempts. After they secured the contract, the mayor said the mood of this town changed from depression to euphoria. And they essentially saw it as a recession-proof industry. So again, this is kind of illuminating how much both prisons, detention centers, jails became a part of the political economy, and actually why, in a lot of cases, probably the #1 reason why people don't want to end contracts is because they're going to lose some of those resources, some of the money that's going to jobs and other things in town. So the last point I want to make is how the systems are intertwined is related to national security frameworks, which started to take shape in federal policy in the 1990s. There was an earlier World Trade Center bombing and other things that happened in the 90s. And a couple of those laws that I mentioned earlier led to more sort of national security frameworks, the Oklahoma City bombing and other things, but that really laid the foundation for, once 9/11 happened in 2001, for really there to be just a massive amount of resources going into these systems. And so while the war on terror is often understood as a huge injection of resources and capital towards U.S. militarism, the domestic war on terror often worked through the criminal legal system and became an extension of the war on crime. This meant more detention, more prisons, more policing at the border. So you know, like I said, or like Jonathan said, I'm from Texas. I was born and raised there. I was organizing, and I had graduated around this time in 2003. And my first job was with an organization called Grassroots Leadership, and a lot of my work, like I was a quote unquote criminal justice advocate or organizer, but a lot of my work ended up actually being about fighting immigrant prisons at the border, because there was essentially a prison boom happening in South Texas at that time, and it was right after DHS was created, it was right after Department of Homeland Security, right after ICE was created. And you know, one of the things that was wild is that we saw, and this is one of the things I want to kind of get to, is there's a lot of people will sort of single out immigration detention as, oh, these individuals are there, they haven't been criminal, like they haven't actually been convicted of a crime and they're just in detention for a civil proceeding, which is absolutely true. But the reality is that, you know, that's sometimes besides the point. I mean, I think the desire is just lock up more and more people. And this was the case that we saw in South Texas, where actually you saw immigration criminal referrals. So for the act of crossing the border, people were getting 6 months in jail. If you did it twice, you could get 18 months in federal prison. It could be a felony, get 2 years in federal prison, sometimes up to 20 years in federal prison. So you saw this ballooning and ballooning of more and more people going into the system. And because of this, because you saw this like rapid rise in immigration crimes, and I was fighting this particular prison in Laredo, Texas, where they're trying to build this massive super jail. And we saw just in 1 year, the number of referrals go up 345%. And so that's what we started to see, more and more people being funneled. And by 2004, immigration crimes became the most prosecuted offense in the federal courts. And not, you know, now I think drug crimes are the highest, but only by a little bit. It really is like 30% drug crimes, 30% immigration crimes. There was another program that went into place here around this time called Operation Streamline that would just prosecute people en masse. So a dozen people with their, you know, completely shackled up at their waists, at their wrists, at their ankles, come into a room and would be prosecuted all at once, a single ruling applying to all of them. And then they would go into these jails, these U.S. Marshals jails at the borders for 6 months often, before they were deported. And if they tried to come back, then they would be in federal prison for 18 years. I mean, 18 months. So all of this is to say, that's just a really quick summary of how these systems are intertwined. I get a lot more into it in the book. But this is kind of the core argument. This is a Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote, as Jonathan mentioned her before. The system works to move the line of what counts as criminal to encompass and engulf more and more people into the territory of prison eligibility. Again, this is why I think it's so important that we, you know, question whether frameworks around innocence are the frames that are going to help us get to the place we want to go. Like, we really actually have to understand what the goal of the prison expansion is, and how more and more people are sort of engulfed. And that's what we started to see in South Texas. So getting to my sort of second point, I want to highlight the ways that reformist approaches, which are often informed by the idea of the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, have only resulted in more detention and deportation, and also more divisions between our movements. So the Obama era, and I don't know how many folks remember much of it, but it's a while now, but the Obama administration was a particularly instructive moment. I actually write a whole chapter about those years in my book because I think there's so much to learn from them, and how a sort of liberal reformist approach actually lent itself to more and more detention and more deportation. So, you know, this is the Karnes County Civil Detention Center. And before this point, a lot of the way that, you know, people just didn't actually like think about detention and prison that differently. And at this point, people started to say, actually, no, the people who are going into detention are there for a civil proceeding, like I was talking about before. And so instead of saying, okay, well, these individuals are there for a civil proceeding, why don't we just let them go through their immigration proceeding while they're at home with their loved ones, while they can still work and do all the other things. And they said, no, actually, let's just make nicer facilities. And so this was the strategy of the Obama administration. Like, oh, well, you're complaining about conditions a lot, but we actually think we can work with private prison companies to make nicer facilities. And so what we ended up seeing during the Obama years was an expansion of these types of facilities, the Karnes County Civil Detention Center, which ostensibly was like, hey, this is nicer and this is going to treat people better. But actually, a lot of the people who ended up in there were quote unquote minimum security. And there was sort of this question of like, well, if they're not priorities, why are you detaining them in the first place? And so the system expanded more and more. I have this image up here, and this is from a family detention center in New Mexico, the Artesia Detention Center. And what ended up happening actually is once there was this sort of like increase of families coming to the border in 2014, immediately they turned Carnes into a family detention center. And so that's what we started to see, this administration saying, well, we're going to do some good things, but actually we're just going to make detention nicer, and we're going to make it nicer by working with more private prison companies to make it nicer. And I think by when Obama came into office, it was roughly 50% privately operated, the detention system, and by the end of it was 70%. Right now it's closer to 90%. So just to share sort of how liberalism sort of lends itself to these neoliberal sort of approaches and also the expansion of the system. There was also, the other thing I would just mention is, and this is Janet Napolitano, who was DHS secretary when she came in, who was also the former governor of Arizona. And, you know, one of the goals was to, like, one of the strategies we used, and we kept saying, the conditions are bad, you know, and they ended up making nicer facilities, and, you know, you should release people, there are alternatives to detention. But what we ended up seeing is because there was this expansion of alternatives, they didn't actually release people from detention, they just created more forms of surveillance. And this is true in the criminal legal system. We see this all the time, where now people were being put on ankle monitors or had some sort of other check-in process and GPS monitoring. And instead of releasing people from detention, it actually just created this whole other category of people who would have never otherwise been detained be in some form of surveillance. And so it made the system larger and larger, and we also still saw detention go up. So at the same time, both of those things were happening, and it ballooned at that point. I mean, that was when it really started to take off. And then by the time we get to the Biden administration, they're so deep and committed to alternatives to detention that some 300,000 people at some point were under an alternative, mostly GPS monitoring system. So like I said, in chapter 2, I unpack how all of these sort of intentions to reform played out under the Obama administration. What was so damaging about that time is that Obama continuously affirmed the argument that immigration itself is a public safety issue, which, to be clear, it is not. Immigration is about family relationships, it's about labor, of course, and it's also about seeking refuge, which we hear time and time again, but it's not really a public safety issue. But this was kind of the line in the administration, in the Obama administration's line of thinking. Immigrants with criminal convictions were the core problem, and our way to quote unquote fix the system was to get better at targeting those immigrants who had encountered the criminal legal system in order to make the case for those who hadn't. So essentially, like, the people who don't interact with the criminal legal system, let's help them by making the case that we can target all these other people. Through programs like Secure Communities, which is this, I mean, they always take our language, but Secure Communities, which was this like database program that brought people in through the booking process at jails. The Obama administration more closely linked ICE with local jails, bringing more and more people into the system. Through these reforms, Obama became the quote unquote deporter in chief. So the movement had sort of labeled him that because there was hundreds of thousands of deportations and formal deportations. More formal deportations took place during those years than any other president. And I think this distinction is very important. Formal deportations or removals mean that people who are deported this way have a 5-year bar to re-enter the country. If they do try to re-enter and are caught by Border Patrol and prosecuted, they could get anywhere from 2 years to 20 years in federal prison, which is what I was talking about earlier. So this is a system that's handed over to Trump. And then the Trump administration uses the carceral apparatus at the border, which has become that much more robust to carry out systemic family separations in 2018. So if folks don't remember, in 2018, there was a zero tolerance policy where families were separated at the border. And what ended up happening is when a family was separated, they would take the parents and put them in U.S. Marshals custody because they were serving a sentence for a crime, and ship their children to different camps or shelters. And it was a moment where people were like, we have to abolish ICE, look what's happening. But it was actually the U.S. Marshal Service, the Department of Justice, U.S. attorneys, prosecutors, those were the entities that were actually involved in carrying out the family separation. So I think this is, again, the reason why we have to understand the different layers of the criminal legal system and the different pressure points to doing everything we can to get people out. But this sort of shows how actually it was like, I mean, in a lot of ways, Obama just followed what George W. Bush had been doing, but just kind of did it more effectively, and numbers started to go up and up. And then Trump just sort of took it to the next level. And I think this is a real question of what we're going to see with Trump 2.0. But it wasn't just Obama or the Democrats that played up the good versus bad immigrant frame. The mainstream parts of the immigrant rights movement, and especially lobbyists in DC, used that sort of good versus bad immigrant frame to push support for comprehensive immigration reform. The logic of comprehensive immigration reform means trading off border militarization and more criminalization of immigrants for mass legalization of the 11 million undocumented people living in the US. In order to make their case, Beltway groups emphasize immigrants as exceptional and especially productive, patriotic, and relatively innocent. And shout out to Angelica Chasero, who I'm going to talk to soon, who has done so much incredible scholarship on this. Often these groups leaned on the argument that immigrants commit less crimes than US citizens. In fact, many immigrant rights advocates make this argument repeatedly without any critique of the criminal legal system or the understanding of the anti-Black racism that underlies such comparisons. This sort of framing really ends up pitting working class communities against each other. It's like the model minority myth, often applied to Asian Americans like myself. If there is a model minority, then there is an implied non-model minority that is perceived as inferior and therefore disposable. These are some images from, I'm on the right slide. These are some images from in 2006, there was just like this incredible organic uprising of marches, immigrant rights marches across the country. Over 200 marches, people on the streets. I mean, this is in LA, millions of people on the street. It was absolutely incredible. And it was to fight this really, really harsh immigration bill. But a lot of the narrative that was coming from like the DC lobbyists was, you know, a lot of that sort of immigrant respectability stuff. And so that's kind of, you know, some of what's happening there. And a lot of like, you know, people were carrying Mexican flags and they were like, no, only carry American flags, that kind of thing happened. But it was an incredible moment and it was incredible to be a part of it. So the other thing, and lastly, and just sort of on this point, I show in the book about how having a better understanding of the relationship between the prison industrial complex and immigration enforcement and embracing abolition has actually helped us start winning campaigns to protect immigrants from deportation, to stop using detention. So Obama more closely tying the criminal justice system to the immigration system. And this is like this weird branding thing that ICE did in the Obama years. They're like, look, we're doing ICE Access and we're gonna have all these fusion centers and different programs that are gonna connect police and FBI and ICE and all these different entities. But we were all trying to figure it out because we were like, they're taking our loved ones, they're taking our community members, and all these people could no longer ignore the crisis of mass incarceration. They could no longer ignore the crisis of racist policing because it was now in their communities in this much more calculated way that we saw under Obama. And so then all of a sudden, immigrant rights activists were trying to figure out what was happening at their local jail, what were these different relationships, and then they started to understand more and more the criminal legal system and its interconnections with ICE, which helped us then say, okay, how do we start throwing a wrench in this? Yeah, so, and you know, a lot of the work was going after things like secure communities is on there, the quote unquote criminal alien program, which has been renamed by Biden, the criminal apprehension program, which whatever, but yeah, there was a lot of that happened under Biden. That's like a whole other story. But basically, you know, and this is what a lot of folks call sanctuary policy. And actually there's really great sanctuary policy in Washington. There was a press conference this morning trying to even make it stronger. And I encourage folks to learn about that. We can talk about it. But you know, a lot of it was sanctuary policy was saying, actually, we're going to disconnect these systems so that immigrants aren't targeted in this way. Another key component of this shift was the rise in Black Lives Matter. It's growing during this period. It's growing under a Black president, and you see how much people were sort of responding to the murder of people like Freddie Gray and Michael Brown and other folks, and seeing what's happening in Ferguson and Baltimore. And there's more and more connections being sort of made, and you had groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights, which was doing both litigation to stop the stop and frisk policy in New York with this very racist policing policy there, and then also doing work to stop secure communities, this sort of intersection of immigration and the criminal legal system. And those folks were all working together and sort of starting to understand these connections. And again, I think the rise of these things, people started to make more and more of those connections. And of course, and I think this is so deeply why we got to a place where there was some incredible wins on this in this movement, was the rise of the immigrant youth movement, people who are sort of coming to age and realizing the sort of limited opportunities that exist, and also that they would be for being targeted. So you saw in places like Arizona, this overlapping with people who are fighting immigration enforcement, dreamers, like there's a lot of overlap, and they were taking agency for themselves, organizing, having sit-ins at Obama's campaign office. That actually happened like 2 weeks before they announced deferred action for childhood arrivals, and a few months before the 2012 election, just really strategic strategies to disrupt and say, no, we actually want something. And also a lot of youth saying, no, we're not just gonna fight for ourselves, but we're gonna fight for our parents, we're gonna fight for our community as a whole. And you had groups like United We Dream making connections to groups like Black Youth Project 100, groups that seeing the interconnections between what youth are tackling, youth of color were tackling at the time, and all those connections. I think these things were so, so important to enriching and building a movement, making those interconnections. So combined with sanctuary policy, as I named, with things like deferred action for childhood arrivals, commonly known as DACA, temporary protected status, which is this policy that allows people from certain countries to stay in the US and have work authorization. Deportations went down. I mean, deportations were so, so high during the Obama years, and they start to really go down. And they actually, of people living in the country right now, they haven't really gone up that much for the most part. And that's because of these wins. I also wanted to mention specifically, you know, another piece that was happening during this period was also a lot of uprisings in prisons. And so this is the Raymondville Detention Center. Sometimes it's been called RITMO, like Gitmo, the Guantanamo Bay facility. It's like a tent city, ostensibly. It's made out of these Kevlar tents. It technically no longer exists, but there's like another facility there that's kind of been repurposed. But there was a lot of uprisings. I mean, the conditions in these federal prisons that were segregated to hold immigrants. So this is a lot of that population I was talking about who were, you know, maybe they had been deported and they tried to come back and they got 18 months in prison. Many of the men who were here had 18 months in prison, and they had like no medical services, absolutely nothing. And they, you know, rioted, and they were like, no, this is not okay. These conditions aren't okay. They actually burnt down part of the facility, which is incredible. That happened there. There was multiple other uprisings and multiple other things that happened in Adams County, in Mississippi, and in another place in Texas as well. And so that's happening. And also you see BLM making all these sort of strides around mass incarceration and calling attention to these things. And these were segregated private prisons. And so actually by the end of Obama's term, they announced they were going to stop using these facilities for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, not necessarily ICE. But I want to name that. I think it's been the combination of people on the streets, the people who are fighting in the streets who are saying, no, these things are not okay, but also people who are fighting inside and saying the conditions that we're in are not okay, that actually led the Obama administration say, no, okay, I guess we're going to stop using these facilities now. And that was hugely significant. Biden actually went along with this. And so actually, at least for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, they no longer use private prisons, which is huge. we'll see what happens, but that is actually a win that I think we should celebrate. Some of them have been turned into ICE detention centers, but that's another story. I also want to mention on immigrant detention specifically. So for years, like I said, the advocacy community focused on improving conditions and push for alternatives. But as I mentioned, the system kept growing and people kept dying in facilities. Lots of deaths were happening and things weren't getting better. So after we took on a more abolitionist approach to shut down detention centers and defund ICE, and after the social and cultural shifts in light of the uprisings for Black lives in 2020, we start to actually win shutdown campaigns. And in the last 5 or 6 years, some 20 detention centers are no longer in use by ICE because of these efforts. So just again, it's showing how kind of the layers of the movement are building and building, and we were able to take a very particular moment and say, okay, how can we push some of these wins? And after 2020, we actually start to see a lot more of them happening. I write about this a lot in the book. And it's an important sort of conjunctural moment, as they say, where, you know, it's the uprisings, it's also COVID and the pandemic and how that helped people sort of understand the role that these types of institutional settings play in growing viruses and disease and community. There was also a facility in Georgia called the Irwin County Detention Center, where there had been this whistleblower report about forced gynecological procedures and some hysterectomies on women that were held there. And that really blew up and became this sort of catalyst. And again, our thing was like, don't just make the medical conditions better, actually just release people. If people are in these conditions, it's not, these are what they are going to be. And after many years of Trump. So I think that's, you know, that's a lot of what we see. And, you know, together, I think all the points that I'm trying to make clarify why abolition is not just practical, but actually essential in our struggles for racial and migrant justice. And so this is, I mean, I'm about to get to the depressing part, so I just want us to hold on to this for a second. It was actually incredible to see, you know, this facility that is mentioned here. There's, you know, we actually got to a place where politicians were questioning whether we should detain people or not. And that was because of those many years of work and being sort of prepared for that moment in 2020. And we got to a place where 7 states now have passed bills against detention, Washington State being one of them. And we actually got facilities to stop being used in Washington State because of that, which was hugely significant, the Keep Washington Working Act. And this was like in 2021, what was so remarkable, or I guess 2020, what was so remarkable was that Alejandro Mayorkas, who's the outgoing DHS secretary, actually said at some point there was an overuse of detention, and the Biden administration asked for less detention beds. And it just tells you where we were at. Like, we were politically in a different moment, but we also had so many states say, no, we don't want this. So many local communities say, no, we don't want this, that we got to a place where 20 facilities are no longer in use. So hold on to that, because we're about to go to some really depressing whiplash. And that's, I mean, that's really a lot of the argument of the book, a lot of what I sort of get at. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways to keep some of those lessons as you're thinking about your own community and organizing work. So politics of immigration today. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I have a couple minutes left. It's not great. It's really, really, really a tough moment for us. And the person on top here is actually Tom Homan, and behind him is the looming Trump image. And he was actually somebody I interacted with, which is wild to think about because he was working for the Obama administration when I was working at Detention Watch Network. And so when we were sending our reports, we would send them to Tom Homan, and he was this sort of career official, but he was actually the person who was one of the architects of the family separation policy. I mean, that's the thing. I think there's this perception that it's Trump or people like Stephen Miller, but actually these rank and file people within DHS, within Immigration and Customs Enforcement, were actually the people who were ready and willing to carry out these really, really terrible policies, again, making the case for why abolition is what we need to do. So he's going to be, people are calling him the border czar, which sort of doesn't make sense because actually what he's trying to do is focus on people currently living in the US and target them for deportation. And that's what we're going to see. And this bottom picture is Biden. Actually, and you can't see it, but he's holding up a button that says Lake and Riley. And I think people probably are familiar with this. If you're not familiar with this, a woman who was killed in Georgia by an undocumented immigrant who I think he had like a petty theft violation or something. And he, really, really awful, tragic story, but a very, very specific case that had no question about who had done it. And it was kind of a closed and shut case that they are now trying, and this is what they do with moral panics all the time, they're trying to apply this very specific instance of this tragedy and say, we are going to apply it to a whole swath of people and bring a whole bunch more people into the system. And all these politicians are like, this helps us gain political legitimacy, so let's just go along with it. And not just Republicans, Democrats also. And I think that's what's so, so terrifying about this moment, is that these moral panics, they're just capitulating in every way. As I write here, you know, there's the good versus bad immigrant. We're going to see a lot of that because of the criminalization. Old versus new immigrant, this is a lot of the border stuff. It's like, let's keep everyone out and just help the people here. We see this a lot in the movement, continue to see this in the movement, this idea that we can kind of dehumanize people at the border and make the case for people here, which doesn't actually work, because when you dehumanize immigrants in general, it actually makes it harder for us to make the case for people here. I won't get too into this, but one of the things that actually frustrates me is that people focus a lot on Trump. I think Greg Abbott, the governor of my home state, has pretty much ran the game here and had this policy of busing migrants to places like New York and Chicago that had weakened social safety nets because of the pandemic and other reasons. And sort of quote unquote bringing the border to these cities, and it created all this tension because the Biden administration was failing to provide services or resources, and communities of color started being pitted against each other. And the Democrats had no sort of vision or anything to offer, and it just leaned into this sort of like rightward framing on immigration. The Lake and Riley Act's moving in Congress right now. We're doing everything we can to stop it. And yeah, well, I think with Angelica, we can talk a little bit more about what's going to happen, or if folks have questions. And then just on immigration detention today, you know, we did see some reduction. I mean, under the first Trump president, it was at 55,000 was the height of the detention system. So it did go down. It partially went down because of the pandemic, but it also went down because of our campaigns and our efforts to shut down facilities. But the Biden administration has already tried to start expanding, and you know, I think we're all just bracing ourselves for what happens on Monday and Tuesday. And y'all can keep up to date with Detention Watch Network on that. The last thing I wanted to share before we get into conversation is that in the end of the book, we have a sort of critical resistance has put together a few different guides on like, you know, how to have a lens around your strategies of whether they're abolitionists or not and what to think about. And there's some guiding questions. And so we did that for detention. And these are the questions that we have, and something I think we should sort of stay with as we think about the terrain of work that we're in. Does this step reduce the scale of detention and surveillance? Does this step chip away at the current system without creating new harms or helping some people at the expense of others? I think both in our strategies around conditions and alternatives, you know, didn't really pass muster there. Does this step provide relief to people who will be or are currently detained or under surveillance? So these are some things to think about. I think here's a little bit of, this is actually a facility we got like no longer detains. This is the Etowah County Detention Center, one of the worst facilities in the country. It no longer detains people for ICE because of all the work that so many people and so many people on the inside did for many, many years. And so I'll leave us there. But thank you everyone so much for sitting through that. Here, I'll bring this. Should we turn up the lights?
Yeah, turn up the lights.
And then I guess, do you want me to just put it Or could we just?
I think we can try.
Right, well, now we're gonna have a conversation between Silky Shah and I want to introduce very quickly Professor Chazaro. We are so lucky to have Professor Chazaro here on Seattle's campus. He's a associate professor of law at the UW School of Law. Professor Chazaro is the author of a number of important law review articles on immigration, deportation, and their one law article in your entire life.
You don't need to.
There's only one law article you can read your entire life. Read Professor Chazaro's deportation abolition from U.S Law Review. It will change your understanding so many parts of law. And I also want to say that Professor Chazaro is one of the leading fighters in Washington state that works with communities, her community and other communities, to free people from detention and incarceration here at the Northwest Detention Center. You may know or you may not know that today the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals, upheld a legal judgment against the GEO Group. GEO Group is a private prison company that runs the Northwest Detention Center here in Tacoma, one of the largest detention centers in all the United States. The GEO Group, to maximize profits, not only detained people, but then also demanded that detained people clean their facilities and cook the food for their own detentions. And we're giving them only $1 a day for all service labor and menial labor inside. Angelica wrote a friend of the court brief along with others and fought for people inside. And with the legal cases, people won an unjust enrichment award for not having minimum wage inside these facilities across all of them, by the way. Many parts of it. Angelica Chazaro is also today involved in a press conference that Silky was mentioning to call on Governor Ferguson to prioritize not parole, sorry, not clemency. What is it here?
Clemency and pardency.
Pardons, basic clemency of people who have criminal convictions, so that they will not be caught up in Trump's deportation on Monday. And it's just working so profoundly with such clarity of anyone I know on how to make sure we take what we are learning and maximize that knowledge for protecting people in our communities from the state violence. And with that, I will
Everyone should have John then introduce them at some point.
I know, it's like a real ego boost. You're like, oh my God, she sounds amazing. No. I will say that I wrote maybe 80% of the end of deportation sitting next to Chandan being like, what about this, Chandan? He's like, yeah, sounds good, sounds good. So I also suggest if you want to write good stuff, just, find Chandan at a coffee shop and sit next to him. Thank you, sweetie. Silky, thank you all. Thank you so much, for writing this book. Like, I can't tell you how busy Silky is, and the fact that in all that, you also managed to take a sabbatical, i.e. 2 weeks to just bang this out is like, I'm just in awe. Sure. But so much work. I guess I sort of wanted to start where you ended, which is with that slide about abolitionist discernment, because for me, especially teaching abolition, I think a lot about what abolition gives us is a way to distinguish between the things that are going to actually reinforce, all the wrongs and make things worse, and the kinds of moves, policy moves, organizing moves, et cetera, that actually lead us towards the world we want, which is a world without detention. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how it is that you sort of brought those practices of abolitionist discernment that you learned in the criminal legal system space into immigration, and why that matters now. What implications does that have for what we'll do starting on Monday and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of it is that, it's the argument I'm making. The systems are fully intertwined. So you can't kind of I think there was so much intention, and especially in those Obama years, to say, okay, well, immigrants are going through something different, so let's treat them. And this is kind of everything. Immigrants are constantly like, you know, marginalized, but also exceptionalized. Like that point that I was making about how so many immigrant rights groups constantly are saying immigrants commit less crimes than U.S. citizens. And it's like, well, what is that doing that actually doesn't help connect communities of color and sort of understand why we have more criminalization, not just of immigrants, but of working class people, of poor people, of communities of color, of course. And so I think the part of that sort of question is actually like, once we started to realize that no, these systems aren't different, you kind of had to bring it in. And this is one of the points that we've been making so much about what's about to happen with the Trump administration, is that in every single way, they're going to sort of treat it as, oh, here's this thing, this mass deportation agenda against immigrants, but actually the easiest way for them to do this is with law enforcement, and law enforcement that already exists, and with prisons and jails that already exist. And even if they're going to grow those things, like in every single way, the way the deportation agenda happens is through sheriffs and local police, and them working really closely with ICE. And so I guess from my perspective, like that, those kinds of questions of sort of discern, like how to bring that piece in, it's like, we're actually going to lose if we don't bring that piece in. We have to do this together. And in those moments when that bigger consciousness was there, it was easier to make the case for immigrants. And that's, you know, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that if we continue to silo our movements, it's gonna hurt other folks. And I didn't have these slides up, but one thing to name is that, you know, there's been a lot of recycling of facilities as well. So a lot of facilities in California, for instance, that were state prisons, private prisons that are no longer used by the state of California, are now private prisons that ICE is using. And we see this kind of happen all over the place. And so I think that, you know, if we don't do that, then actually it hurts us so much more.
On that point, because that was another question I had, you know, like one of the most heartbreaking parts of the book is where you talk about how in Louisiana there was this huge push to decarcerate and to like shrink the criminal legal system, and they succeeded, right? Like they really did it. And then all of those empty jails that had been used for the criminal legal system then was like taken up by ICE, right? By, you know, vis-a-vis the private companies. And so I'm wondering, like, what would it look like to actually, you know, or, you know, what sort of work has EWN done to imagine what it would look like to, like, not just like end the Etowah contract for immigrant detainees, for example, in Alabama, but for like everyone who's still in that jail, or what it would look like to like end these facilities for incarceration in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to point to, and I think, you know, why I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work and other folks who've worked around this sort of political economy of these questions is so deeply important, is that this is ultimately about these local political economies. And, you know, in California, for instance, it's been really amazing to see groups like Californians United for a Responsible Budget, CURB, which is phenomenal. I think actually every state should have a CURB, and has done so much work to make those connections between groups that are doing work around public health, doing work against incarceration, to shut down facilities, and CURB really focuses on that. And also groups working against immigrant detention, they sort of put forward this budget to save lives, like what can we do with that? And through a lot of that organizing and work, local groups and the Dignity Out Detention Coalition were able to get the HEAL Act passed, which actually provides money to counties that are willing to move away from immigration detention for job training and other sort of possibilities. So like a just transition, a transition away from carceral economies. And so I think that, to me, you know, that ability to, like, what's been so helpful about budget advocacy is that you can kind of dream about actually what do we need? Like, let's stop putting money into incarceration, into U.S. militarism, into all the other things that are doing so much harm. And actually, what does it look like if we had resources for what we needed? And even just having those surveys locally, I think it helps people understand, like, people don't want prison jobs. People don't want these things, but this is what's available. And so how can we actually look and think about alternative economies?
I guess another thread I sort of wanted to pull out, because I think it's so important, is this, and you pointed this out, is a sort of like good immigrant versus bad immigrant, you know, framework that we're all invited to like dig into. And I feel like, especially now Trump Part 2, we're going to be invited again into that, right? And it's so painful to see, and it's so painful to see like the Democratic capitulation to this. I won't raise your blood pressure too much, Silky, because that's rude. But I guess I'm thinking about like, what are the moves that we can be making to sort of push back on that, and or where have you seen that happen? How does that happen, right? Because it's easy to say like, no, stop saying we are not criminals. And I do remember, when I worked out in Wenatchee, when I was still practicing as an immigration lawyer, I remember seeing 2 flyers for an immigration march, a May 1st march, and the one in English was like, show up and support your immigrant neighbors, like come one, come all, and the one in Spanish was like, in Spanish, like, show up, but don't bring your Mexican flag. Like, don't, chant anything in Spanish, like only chant it. I mean, it was so clear that it was like, show up as like the ideal, citizen to be, and don't show, any loyalty to any other country. Like even just in the flyers, that was so clear. And so to me, it's clear like how not to do that. But I think sometimes for folks, because so much of the immigrant rights advocacy we've seen has been like, we're just like you, let us in. We just, let us clean your houses. Like we promise not to like stage an uprising. Like that's the sort of advocacy we're invited into. Like what does the other side look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's been it's something I've had to sort of like reckon with a lot, to be totally honest. Like my job for 20 years now has been to make the case for the person who's deemed the bad immigrant, the person who's deemed disposable. But the thing that became so hard, especially this last year, and with Kamala Harris's campaign and obvious, I mean, everything the Republicans are doing, but that's expected. But what the Democrats were doing, and Kamala Harris sort of positioning herself as more hardline than Trump, was that actually the good immigrant narrative wasn't even there anymore, which was so, and I was like, oh, actually, it's so much harder for me to do the thing I need to do without some narrative that immigrants are good, that immigration is a good thing. And so I'm reckoning with that a little bit, because I do think we still have to say these are our family members, our neighbors, our community members. They're a part of they're a part of our society. Like this is how the world works. Like these are our communities, but not lean into that sort of exceptionalizing frame. And then I think I think one of the important things to recognize is that so much of this is about immigrant scapegoating, because people are desperate, because people feel economically insecure, because there's a scarcity mindset, because there's this, again, because all of our resources are going to harmful institutions as opposed to going to healthcare. I mean, that's, not in the news as much anymore, but like, there's just this like sort of sense of, or education, or how there is a housing crisis, there is an opioid crisis. These things are real. And if we were going to do something about those and have the resources go to that, people wouldn't be feeling that. So if people's conditions in the US were actually better, it makes it easier for us to make the case for immigrants.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I think I'm also thinking about that, because I think in the framing, so there was a press conference this morning that Chandan alluded to, where immigrant rights groups and other groups that work specifically with prisoners in Washington state invited our governor, as of yesterday, Bob Ferguson, to actually do the right thing and protect immigrants. And we know that like the front door to Trump's mass deportation plan goes right through people who are already, we've been invited to sort of dispose of, right? We also know that like in his first interview after being elected as governor, Ferguson said, yeah, I'm all ready to defend immigrants. I mean, I'm totally fine with deporting the criminals, but like everybody else, I'm totally there for you, right? So it's like he's already invited the rest of us to say, yes, Bob Ferguson, who sued Trump more than any other attorney general, now is our like leader against the Trump regime, except that he's already acceded to the deportation of people who are in DOC custody, right, in prison custody. And so, it was, to me, the importance of doing a press conference is, yes, not only to pressure Ferguson, but also to invite all of these different groups who identify as immigrant rights groups to identify very strongly, not just as immigrant rights groups, but as groups who, as immigrant rights groups, have to prioritize people in prison first and foremost, right? Because if we win that fight, then I feel like we will have won so much more. And yet so much of what we're invited to do as like more traditional immigrant rights works isn't to do that work, is to point to sort of like the exceptional, or to just expand access to like healthcare, but of course not for any immigrant who might have a criminal conviction, and do those carve outs. So it's like starting the demand with ending the carve outs for people who are criminalized seems like the right move at this moment, right? That's not the question. I don't know.
But that's the thing that they're going to do. Like Stephen Miller is going to be like, day one, here are all the sheriffs who are going after the worst of the worst, and look at us, and we're doing the thing we said. And even though they have this spectacle of we're going to go after everybody, we're going to go after families, and we're going to deport whole family members, it's actually the way they're going to do this is through the criminal legal system. And the Democrats have already capitulated because they're trying to pass this terrible, terrible bill.
We talked about it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Lake and Riley bill, and, I told you all the story about what happened, and we've seen this time and again, and there's just because I like reflecting on history, there was a moment in the 1980s whenever we were seeing all these tough and crime laws be passed more and more, and there was like the Bush Sr. actually exploited the story of this man, William Horton, who had been released from prison for a period of time and was, accused of committing a rape. And it became this sort of sensational story, and it actually won Bush the election. I mean, it absolutely, led to Bush winning. And then the Democrats, ultimately, the lesson they learned from that was like, oh, tough on crime policies wins elections. And this is sort of what we're seeing right now on immigrant. The lesson the Democrats are taking right now is that with Trump winning this election, that indicates to them that actually moving to the right on immigration is the thing to do. But it's kind of wild because Harris was already positioning herself as more hardline than Trump throughout her campaign. And so it's not actually true that that's what was happening with the Harris campaign, but whatever. This is the lesson they've learned. There's also this whole narrative that the groups have gone too far, which is like a whole other story. So a lot of accusation of, the cases that we're making are hurting us, but the reality was the Democrats offered no other sort of vision, and they're kind of continuing to do that. And so now, just in this last week, I mean, I think none of us were really prepared. I think we're all bracing ourselves for Monday and what's going to come after Monday, which is inauguration. But this started happening in Congress where this Lake and Riley bill, which actually, so the first time we've seen like a very massive expansion of mandatory detention, which I had talked about, which strips due process from people who have certain crimes, and expansion of those crimes and theft related crimes, because that's related to the person who, theft related arrests. So like you can be charged, but you don't even have to be convicted. And then on top of that, states can kind of do whatever they want basically and just say, okay, even if the federal government says this, we can sue you, and say, no, we're not going to agree with what the federal government says on immigration, which is really significant because still immigration is still such a federal thing. And already we've seen states try to like make immigration law, like immigration crime related law, happen at the state level. We see that in Texas and other places, but it's a really, really bad bill, and it's continuing to move. I don't know if you want to say more. I mean, you're a lawyer. So
you're a lawyer. No, fine. I'm a lawyer. I am. Yeah. I mean, when Silky's talking about mandatory detention, what that means is, when you're facing deportation, that's a civil procedure, right? Like you don't have to be in a cage at all. But if you are in a cage, usually you're able to argue before a judge that you should be able to post some sort of bond. Like, okay, if I give you $5,000, will you let me free to fight my case outside of immigration detention? But there's a whole category of basically criminal conduct or criminal convictions that if you have one of those, then you're subject to what's called mandatory detention. So in theory, even if the judge wanted to let you go, they can't. And so what this act does is say, even a person, take my mother as an example. My mother loves to go to Ross so much. Ross in South Seattle is like one of the most highly criminalized spaces. Like literally there's like cops at the entrance, cops at the exit. If my mother, whether or not she shoplifted, was arrested for shoplifting at Ross, then she could be subject to mandatory detention. Even if I got her the best lawyer, it wouldn't matter because ICE immediately, if she was in another state, would be able to transfer her to immigration detention. And even if we wanted to get her free, she would have to be in detention until she won her deportation case, right? Which might take months or maybe years given the backlogs, right? And be subject to all the terrible conditions in detention. And so that's what it is. It's basically saying we just want to be able to cast an even wider net to put more people in detention, which then puts the pressure to build more detention centers and expand more detention centers. And what you were saying before, that like, it's not like, yes, we're all bracing for Monday, but since last fall, Silky and her colleagues have been raising you know, their hands and saying, hey, Biden has already put out requests for proposals for new detention centers, right? This is before we even knew who was going to be president, including here, right? Like they want to expand and cement detention and incarceration of immigrants in general as the strategy. And I guess that gets to this question of like, this is a bipartisan affair, right? Like there's ways in which Trump is exceptionalized, and I guess he is like exceptionally like spectacularly cruel, but like, you know, one of the things that struck me in your book is this sort of bipartisan, lifelong, terrible ness of folks like Giuliani, folks like Biden, folks like Joe Arpaio, you know, the sheriff and the famous sheriff of Arizona started his career as like a DEA agent in Mexico, right? Joe Biden has been like behind and a cheerleader for every single crime bill, like going back to 1984, that has made life miserable for so many people. You know, Giuliani, as you said, was part of like this expansion of detention of being like, yes, yes, where else can we build, right? And so we have these folks who have these like careers built on harm, both on the right and the left. And then we have folks like you and like so many other folks who are building and changing all the time. And so like the thing that gives me hope is that there's folks on the other side who also, if I looked at your like organizing resume, which is not how we build our CVs, but like what it would be like fought against this particular jail, fought against this particular bill, fought against it, like we see the connections. And so we're building these like networks of resistance that like last generations, but like the folks on the other side are also building that and then like becoming president. And so I don't know. It's rough. Yeah, maybe that's not so hopeful, but yeah, I wonder. Yeah, I guess this sense of like the bipartisan nature of immigration enforcement, of militarism, of all of it, how we build against that, given that the Democrats capitulate so quickly. I'm sort of at a loss right now.
I mean, but we've like, it feels really hard right now, but this moment quickly shifted, and it's quickly shifted before, and there's different conjunctural moments. And my whole thing, and this is the case I make about 2020, is like, for years and years, we had been building towards calling for ending detention and calling for protecting people from deportation, and those wins of, DACA and the other things that had happened for years and years. So much effort had gone into making it politically unpopular to target community members. And I think that still exists to some degree, but we were prepared in 2020. We were like, okay, here we are, we're in this moment. We are gonna rally the immigrant rights movement to say, no, stop detaining people. Like, let's do this. And they got behind us. I mean, it was kind of incredible to see. It was incredible to see how much people were ready to move, people who I didn't politically agree with. I mean, this is about coalition, and so much of this work is about coalition and building with people. And you might not agree with them on everything. That's not what a coalition is. The coalition is about saying, here's a very specific thing we agree on, and let's figure this out together, and let's bring a broad group of people. And so being able to get like much more moderate organizations on board with that was actually hugely significant. And that's the work that we did when the space opened up. They were more really ready to go. The other thing I think we need to remember is that after Trump was elected in 2016, Schumer was already like, okay, this is what it is. I guess the Democrats are just going to have to deal with this. This is what Democrats do. They're like, okay, we're just going to work with them. But no, then there was the Women's March. There was other things that happened, and people were like, no, you can't just capitulate to Trump. And I feel like feels harder right now, but that's the reality. We have to do that work. Like, we have to try. And also because there's going to be really horrible things. Like, we haven't had the scale of deportations we had under the Obama years for years now, for over, I don't know, time, but it's been 12 years, whatever it's been. Mass raids and mass deportations. And that's the difference is, Dems really do this through the criminal legal systems. Republicans do it through these worksite raids and other raids. And there's going to be raids in Washington. And there's a big detention center for people to go to, which is concerning because when you have those bigger facilities, it's harder to get people out. But I mean, those are community members. Those are people we can protect. Those are people that we can do work for and do work now and create those rapid response networks. And we've done it before. And so we have to build that muscle again. And it wasn't popular for a reason. And I don't think it'll be popular now. And so I think we need to both do the work to protect people as much as possible and make sure we're not falling into, like, remembering that actually, I think some of the lessons from the Trump administration is the innocence frame only goes so far. Like, it actually doesn't help us to like, it became very surface level to say like, oh, families, we're doing this with families. It's like, no, this is actually affecting everyone. It's happening through the criminal legal system. All incarceration, all deportation is family separation, by the way. But I think the other thing was that there was all this outsourcing of resistance to lawyers and saying, hey, like, ACLU is going to save us because they're going to fight the Muslim ban. Well, it's like, no, Muslim ban 3.0 happened and it stood up in the courts. And, you know, we're just going to get a lot of lawyers to defend immigrants. Like, no, you can have all the lawyers in the world. You're not going to be able to defend the millions of immigrants that live in this country. It has to be organizing. It has to be work on the ground and concerted coalition and effort that makes us get to a better place.